Many already know who this man is, one of the main creators of the most popular superheroes we know and of the entire Marvel universe. But what not everyone knows is that he served in the army, that I work making funeral letters, and that he almost gave up everything we know today. Here I will show you how I got there, and I will tell you something that I found shocking. One of his last conferences in life, in which he left a group of recent graduates one of the most important messages that he has expressed, and that will make you see his work in a different way. Stanley Martin Lieber was born on December 28, 1922 in New York. His parents are a couple of Romanian Jewish immigrants, Celia and Jack Lieber. He has a little brother, Larry Lieber, born 9 years after Stan as a kid. Stan spends his days reading Sherlock Holmes, King Arthur, The Odyssey, and Tarzan. All these stories and more captivate little Stanley, who reads every book that crosses his hands. Jack works as a tailor, but with the onset of the Great Depression, he loses his job. This fact will mark Stan for the rest of his life because it teaches him the value of work and the privilege that is to be able to work. Is this what pushes you to look for work from a young age? Well, in his mind, the best thing that could happen to a person was to have a stable job. His first job is as an assistant in the office of the second largest trouser company in the United States. It's a small job, and it's so recent that the sellers don't take the time to remember your name. Plus, just a week before Christmas, he's fired thanks to all the stories he's read. One of his biggest dreams is to become a famous and talented writer. We see how he walks through the streets carrying a briefcase, hoping that whoever sees him thinks, "What is it about? From a writer?" Leaving high school, he begins to pursue this dream, so he looks for a job that allows him to develop his creative writing. But this first job he gets is very different from the one he has in mind. Instead of writing his masterpiece, he ends up writing obituaries about people who have died or are about to die. Since this work does not satisfy him, he looks for some projects in newspapers, specifically in the caricature section and in local theaters. His introduction into the comic book industry arises from some family connections. His political cousin Martin Gutman gets him a job at Timely Records, the entertainment company where he works as an editor. Stan begins as an assistant for the writing team made up of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, the creators of Captain America. He brings them ink when they run out and coffee when needed, but he is still not involved in the creative process behind the comics. However, thanks to his strong work ethic, they are promoted, which gives him the opportunity to participate in some projects and even create his own character. The problem for Stan is that comic book writing doesn't look like serious work for a writer. Your goal is gain experience and follow your path until you become the new Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of Sherlock Holmes. It's for this reason that he starts using a pseudonym. Stan Lee debuts as a screenwriter for a comic about Captain America. From this, people start to know him only as Stan Lee. This name becomes a kind of alter ego, like his own superhero identity. In 1941, Simmons and Keating leave the company suddenly, and since Stan is the only employee who can do the job, Timely Records asks him to do the editing. The comics and what they find, someone else. That's how Stan Lee goes from editor to editor-in-chief of Timely Records. This is partly a matter of luck, but it's a coincidence that would change the rest of his life. Because he is the writer and editor of most comics, there is no more bureaucracy, so the production process is accelerated, quickly publishing several installments of the superhero series that the company already handled. In addition, while maintaining the pace of delivery, he takes the time to create his first superhero. In 1941, he created the Destroyer, who made his debut in the 1940 comic. There is a misty feeling that this first superhero is partly a product of his context. At that time, World War II was being fought, so his new character has overtones of this. The Destroyer fights against the Nazis, and in a very similar way to Captain America and his powers too, since he obtains them after being injected with a special serum. The character receives moderate success, but before Stanley can expand his story, he volunteers to join the army in 1942. I feel a duty to his nation, and he wants to be part of those heroic battles that his country's war propaganda has built for him. However, his role in the army is not that of a super soldier. When the army learns that he works as a writer, he is sent to Queens to participate in the creation of training manuals, posters, and scripts for training films in the army. One change he makes to the training material is to use comic strips so that men learn faster, and this pays off. The effectiveness of this method demonstrates the power that comics can have. At the end of the war, he meets a girl named Joan. They say that they met by coincidence in a store. When he entered, Joan was the one who opened the door and greeted him, and at that moment Stan answered, "Hello, I think I'm going to fall in love with you." The connection is immediate, and in 1947 they get married. They have a daughter, Joan Silly, whom they affectionately call JC. The couple adore JC, and the love Stan feels for his family is greater than any other. From the first moment he sees Joan, he falls in love with her, and this never changes in his mind. Joan is the perfect woman and bases her characters, particularly the superhero love interests. In it, Stan returns to Timely Comics at the end of the war in 1940. 5. But he finds himself faced with a very different landscape for the comic book industry than he remembered after seeing the atrocities caused by World War II. People aren't interested in reading comics anymore. They don't take them seriously anymore. They see them as a kid's product, and sales drop fast. Another obstacle facing the company is competition. At this time, BC Comics, an industry giant, was beginning to dominate sales of superhero stories. As a result, Timely Comics moves away from superheroes and instead focuses on crime and horror stories. At this point, the company produces whatever is selling, whether it be romances, westerns, horror, you name it. Stan and his team write it, print it, publish it. In addition to being seen as something childish, comics are beginning to be perceived as a gateway to crime, to perversion and terror, a somewhat exaggerated reaction for Captain America stories. But it's the 1950s where there was a very different way of thinking. So even though he was already a well-known character, Captain America is and rejected like the rest of the comics. For this reason, Timely and Comics must send the comics to be reviewed by the Comic Codes Authority, an organization that is in charge of censoring comics. This limits the stories Stan would like to tell with more maturity and depth for the characters. Although he now has a stable job, something he had wanted since he was a child, Stan little by little loses the motivation to write since he was little. His biggest dream was to tell stories about his work. It had become just that, a job. Furthermore, in 1953, a tragedy occurred in his home, which would change his way of seeing life and the work he does at Technicom. In 1953, Joan gave birth to her second daughter, Jean, but just a few hours later, the little girl died. Loss is a very painful event for the couple, destabilizing their lives. At the same time, they are considering leaving their job because they are dissatisfied with the direction the stories have taken. He feels like he's wasting his time. He thinks that while other people are building bridges and making medical advances that will save thousands of lives, he keeps writing stories for children, but when he's about to throw in the towel, his wife cheers him up. Joan tells him that he should continue, but instead of writing for children, she urges him to write about characters he would like to read. However, things get even more complicated when now, in his professional life, another type of loss arises. In 1958, Timely Comics tells its employees that they are about to close the doors of the company because the accounts are not coming out and the competition is too much. Before making this final decision, Timely Comics chooses to spend its last bullet, a task that is assigned to Stanley and Jack Kirby, one of the creators of Captain America, who has returned to work at the company. This last bullet returns to the superhero stories, but with a new goal to create a group of heroes instead of focusing on just one. Taking inspiration from the Justice League, the Fantastic Four are created. With the Fantastic Four and Estan's direction, a new type of hero is born. The priority is to create realistic characters and tell stories that he would like to read. Consequently, these new heroes are good people, but they make mistakes, they stumble and fall, but they always try to do good. Meanwhile, its villains gain depth. Also, instead of being monsters, villains are people who, by their circumstances, have been driven to commit monstrous acts. This adds a level of depth to the characters never seen before, makes them more real and easier to connect with or empathize with. They and their team continue to innovate with the drawing style, but also with the dialogues, which are now much more mature than audiences were used to. In case you don't remember the story of the Fantastic Four, it follows 4 scientists who, after being exposed to cosmic rays on an expedition to outer space, acquire superpowers. The protagonist, Reed Richards, is a good man, but he talks a lot and his companions reproach him for this. Also, the woman in the comic isn't just a love interest or a damsel in distress. She also has powers as good as the other team members. Another aspect that helps readers identify with the characters in addition to surrealism is that instead of creating a fictional city like Metropolis or Gotham City, they place the story in a very real place, which in turn is their home, New York. A very smart decision. With everything ready, the first comic starring this group of heroes comes out in November 1961. The spirits are on the ground because the company is about to go bankrupt and the love they feel for comics is no longer the same. However, and against all odds, the comic becomes a complete success. In addition, it revolutionizes the way superheroes are conceived and gives the company a break to be able to create new characters and new stories that are interconnected and take place in the same universe. They think that since they are doing things differently, they are creating new stories and new characters should also have a new name. That's how that same year, Martin and Stand 100 renamed the company to Marvel something else. Look, with the Fantastic Four, all of a sudden, the company starts getting fan mail. This is something that has never happened with any of the previous superheroes. Now readers write to Stan, whose name appears in their favorite superhero series, asking for advice and thanking him for his stories. Now they ask him for interviews, and Stan realizes they have a new audience reading his comics. Instead of giving up as he wanted before, Stan decides to write what he would like to read. He has an epiphany in these years. What everyone wants is to be entertained in one way or another. It is reading stories, one of the things that make life bearable and art worth living for. Hey, how about this? It is a small pause to thank you who are watching this video for all your support, and also to remind you that if you have not subscribed to my channel, do so at this time. The truth is, you would support me a lot, and you also make sure you don't miss any of the videos I upload. Now we continue with the story. Now Stan sets out to create stories that entertain and reach the reader's heart because he has found value in comics as a means to convey what he wants so much. From this, Marvel enters an incredibly productive period. Taking inspiration from Jekyll and Hyde, a book he had greatly enjoyed in his youth, he writes the story of the Hulk wants to play with the concept of a normal person who can transform into the monster. That's how Bruce Banner is born, the man who lives every day with a green monster inside him. For the design of the character, he takes inspiration from Karloff's Frankenstein. Hulk is the character they work on after the success of the Fantastic Four. He asks Kirby to design a monster that the audience can love. With this character, he aims to demonstrate how there are monstrous parts inside all of us, parts that we try, hide or control. Also explores the idea of how a monster is not necessarily someone bad. Bruce Banner is a good man, Hulk has good intentions, but he's not always in control of himself. The concept of Hulk and his story is a clear example of the turn Marvel has taken. The stories, the characters are much deeper than before, more complex and interesting, although deep down with themes and problems as common as any of us could have. Bruce Banner's first appearance is in the 1962 Incredible Hulk comic book. The character is a success, and proof of this is the amount of fan letters. What do they reach, Marvel? Stan can no longer answer each letter separately and finds himself in need of hiring a secretary named Foss Steinberg, who is specifically in charge of reviewing the mail. Their job is to open the letters, read them, and send a response back to the young people as a solution. Seeing that he cannot give a personalized response to each fan, Stan begins writing to his fans at the end of each comic. The section is called Stan's Softbox, where he addresses the fans directly, gives them advice, thanks them for their interest in the stories, and at the end he signs with his now iconic phrase, Excelsior Esta. Direct and constant with his fans is what makes him so special and would eventually earn him celebrity status. Furthermore, from this dynamic, Stanley becomes the face of Marvel. Fans see his photo at the end of each comic, read his tips, and see his name, which they immediately associate with the company and superheroes. During the early part of the 60s, Marvel experiences growth never seen before. More and more superheroes are being introduced to the universe, and fans rush to the newsstands to buy the latest adventure of their favorite heroes. However, the most iconic character that Stan Lee Marvel introduces is Spider-Man. The idea arises when I remembered a magazine I read as a child called The Spider. The 1960s is the first time that there is a considerable generation gap between young people and adults, with the latter judging adolescents for everything they do. Seeing the treatment received by this group, which in many ways is vulnerable, seeks to represent its point of view without hostility and with respect. Eston remembers what his life was like at 17 and how they didn't treat him with respect for his age. He decides he will change that with warning a teenager into a superhero. Spider-Man is Marvel's answer to a wish that fans had expressed from years earlier. They wanted to see a teenager in the role of a hero. This is not surprising if we consider that most readers are very young and want to be represented in the comics they read. Stan comes up with the idea with Martin, his superior, and he for the first time tells him no. How is he going to be a superhero? A teenager? In the same way, Stan feels that he must write about this character. Since his boss did not let him create a series around him, he decides to include him in Amazing Fantasy, a comic that was going to be discontinued in shortly. For this edition, he puts Spider-Man on the cover and tries to tell his story and demonstrate the many problems he faces. Even though he had very few pages to pull this off, Spider-Man is a hero like no other. When Stan imagined the character, the most important thing for him was to create something more than a hero. His idea was always to create a person with whom everyone could identify. Spider-Man has superhuman strength, he can climb any wall and swing the tallest buildings, but Peter Parker is still a teenager who must heed what his aunt tells him. May her experience is a reflection of all teenagers who at the height of their youth feel they can eat the whole world, achieve anything they set their mind to, and for whom the possibilities are endless, but they still live under their parents' roof and therefore must abide by their rules. Besides the fact that at that age virtually any adult is an authority figure, when Emmaus Infantas and it goes on sale, the audience falls in love with Spider-Man and wants to see more of him. Martin asks Stan to create a series about the hero, and Stan makes the series his magic. Published in 1963 under the name The Amazing Spider-Man. Originally, Jack Kirby would be the one who was going to illustrate the Spider-Man series, but his drawing style is too heroic. This is good for a story like Captain America, but not for Spider-Man, who is at the end of the day just a teenage girl, Stan. He then approaches Steve Ditko, who has a much more realistic style, and finds the perfect match. With Spider-Man, an icon is born. Stan Lee realizes that the essential ingredient in creating a superhero is empathy. What makes a hero or anyone memorable? It's actually being able to identify with him, feel empathy for him. In this sense, Spider-Man is the perfect example of this. The popularity of this teenage superhero is manifested not only in the comics. In '67, the cartoon of the same name came to light. The great success that the company enjoys thanks to the incredible Spider-Man leads them to launch animated series of the other heroes. These adaptations, as many of us already know today, will also become an essential part of the Marvel brand. A few years ago, Stan commented in an interview that what they do at Marvel is take the old legends and give them a Marvel-style twist, and that's precisely what they're about to do with a Norse god called Thor in '62. Stanley and Kirby work alongside Larry Lieber, Stan's brother, on the development of this new character. If Spider-Man is Stan's big hit, Thor is like Jack Kirby's son. Kirby had always had a fascination with mythology, and now he is presented with an opportunity to bring one of the great gods of Norse mythology to life. Shortly after Thor, Stanley creates Tony Stark, and his entire story, a line that fascinates audiences and demonstrates Stan's abilities to that. See complex and deep characters. Having worked on so many characters, Stan realizes that in a way what they are creating with Marvel is a new type of mythology. From this idea arises one of Marvel's most famous features, crossovers. Now that they have a repertoire of characters, they decide to use them as if the comic book were a stage and they were their actors. After all his characters live in the same universe. Together with Jack Kirby, they work on a new comic where the characters most loved by the public form a team. This is how the Avengers were originally born. Among those who are part of the team are Thor, Iron Man, Hulk, Ant-Man, and the Wasp Man. For comic number 4 in the series, they are joined by Captain America after being found trapped in the ice. The crossover was quite a hit and a very smart move by Stan Lee and Marvel. From this point on, characters from a series can appear in stories that do not belong to their own series. It is something that fascinates and excites fans to expect to see their favorite superhero in a different context, making an appearance in other comics. Thanks to this sales skyrocket and Marvel enters a very productive era, Marvel has always taken inspiration from political and social events that occur in the real world. Proof of this is the character of Captain America himself, created during World War II to demonstrate the fight against Nazism and its ideals. So when the Vietnam War begins, Stan and his team don't sit idly by. Stan uses the character of Iron Man to make a critique of a war that is considered unnecessary, cruel, and in Stan's own words, obscene. In the comics, Tony Stark sells weapons to the US Army. These two themes are very closely related, so the figure of Tony is invested in something difficult to love, which is why they choose to qualify the character in Marvel. The line that divides the heroes from the villains is very thin, and they use it to his favor. Yes, Iron Man is the superhero of the story, but this does not mean that his actions are always the right ones. In this case, selling weapons to the army for a cruel and destructive war is indefensible. Sam has realized the impact of comics on readers and makes the effort to include moral lessons and social criticism in them with the intention of bringing good to the world. This is what I had been looking for, a purpose in one of his efforts to spread his message against intolerance towards minorities. Decides to create a new group of superheroes who are actually an allegory for all those people who are different, who do not conform to the idea of what society has ruled is normal. That's how the X-Men are born. To create an allegory that works for all those who are different, it uses the idea of mutation, something that exists in real life, and instead of this meaning a problem or illness for the characters, it gives them powers. In the comics, mutants are hated simply because of the fact that they are different. The audience persecutes them, harasses them, fears them. What they're doing with their story is to humanize them. It seeks to teach readers that just because someone is different from us doesn't mean they're bad or that we should fear them. Stan Lee truly thinks the world would be a better place if people treated each other with more consideration or respect, and through his stories, he seeks to share this message. Another effort to include diverse characters in Marvel is the creation of the Black Panther, a character for which Stan Lee and Jack Kirby worked together on the design. You both know it's time to burn, but I have an African-American superhero. A large portion of the American population is African-American, and they have not been positively represented in the entertainment media. The Black Panther is a superhero from Africa, with the same intellect as Rick Richards, one of the most intelligent characters in Marvel, and with powers as incredible as Captain America. This sends a clear message to the African-American reader: I show him all he is capable of. One reason kids love Marvel stories is that they treat them like people. Comics, although they share a moral message, do not try to dedicate to young people. They have enough confidence to believe that they themselves can understand, that they can learn to differentiate between good and evil. Stan Lee is the person to thank for this. From the beginning, it shows great respect for children and young people. An example of this is the vocabulary used in comics. When Stan becomes Marvel's editor, he tells writers to use college-level vocabulary. Sure, kids won't know all the words the first time, but they'll learn them from the comics. He maintains that there is no topic too difficult or mature that children cannot understand. They just must. Finding a way to teach them, having a considerable amount of children and youth audience, Stan goes out of his way to teach children about real life and prepare them for her. In '72, Stanley is named Marvel's publicist and Roy Thomas is named the new editor-in-chief. He takes control of the stories and becomes a businessman. The problem is that he doesn't like business. Instead of focusing only on the financial side of publications, he takes the time to travel the country and talk about Marvel, about the characters, the new projects that are in production, working on keeping Marvel relevant ever since. From his trench appear television shows, radio shows, he gives interviews and lectures at universities. Known as the superhero of the comic book industry, he has achieved celebrity status, and when one thinks of Marvel, they think of him as Stan Lee. With all this, they are consolidating their image as the face of Marvel. This is both for the eyes of the public and for the eyes of the big Hollywood brands and producers, something that will be very important for the following decades. In '81, he moves to Los Angeles where he learns that his work with superhero stories is particularly popular. Enter European film directors. Alain Resnais, for example, the director of the acclaimed film Hiroshima Mon Amour, proposes to Stan to work together to adapt Spider-Man to the big screen. However, '80s Hollywood is not yet ready for superhero movies. His reluctance to these stories can be seen in the low budgets and mediocre scripts. Among the projects stands out one, The Incredible Hulk, which is more of a detective series than a faithful adaptation of Bruce Banner's story, while the series and movies were not well received. Cartoons such as Incredible Spider-Man, The Fantastic Four, and Thor continued to be successes with fans for his work. In 1986, Stanley was appointed vice president of Marvel's Creative Affairs Department. Unfortunately, Marvel's reputation and consequently Stan's is damaged mid-decade due to a controversy with Kirby, who by this point had already left Marvel and was now working for DC Comics. Marvel and Stan asked Kirby to waive any copyright in exchange for returning his original art, which is still in the hands of the company. When the news is made public, the public is. That and the whole matter is made even worse when we consider that Stanley, a few years earlier, argued strongly for the right of artists and writers to own their art. By '87, Marvel and Kirby sign a deal, but the damage was already done. It will take a lot of time and effort to restore the public image that he had cultivated so much to its former self. Although the relationship between Stan and Kirby suffered as a result of the copyright issue. When Kirby dies in 1994, Stan attends the funeral and personally takes care of his wife, Ross Kirby. Why was a pension from Marvel? The '90s were a decisive decade for the company. The new owner, Ronald Perelman, knows how important Stan Lee is to the Marvel brand, so he offers him a lifetime contract. This is a good decision on Ronald's part, but he also makes other very risky ones that don't favor Marvel as much. The main decisions that bring Marvel to the brink of bankruptcy are the large, constant, and expensive purchases it makes. Just as public interest in comics goes down, Perelman buys a comic book distributor called Heroes World Decision. It brings him losses, but despite these bad decisions, there is something that has been pushing the company and that will put the company at a level never seen before. Adaptations. The first official adaptation of a Marvel comic to the big screen was 1989's Punisher, which had moderate success, seeing that perhaps this was the way to go. The company continued with other adaptations such as 1990's Captain America and 1998's Blade. In addition to advertising in commercials and television, Stanley took advantage of his popularity and charisma to give interviews and increase visibility of these new projects, but what really marks a breaking point is the 2000 X-Men film starring Hugh Jackman and Ian McKellen. This movie had a budget of $75,000 and managed to raise no more and no less than almost $300,000, which is a return on investment of about 300%. In addition to being a financial success for the company, it gave Marvel Films a seal of guarantee and quality thanks to the spectacular special effects. And here are the action scenes. And if that were not enough, this was the first Marvel movie in which Stanley had a small cameo playing a hot dog vendor in the scene where Mr. Kelly emerges from the ocean after being transformed into a mutant. A little wink and show of affection for all the fans watching are like a close friend. Afterwards, Marvel continued to release movies and Stanley continued to make cameos in each of them. In 2012, Spider-Man was released starring the beloved Tobey Maguire, one of the films and characters most loved by fans because of how easy it is to relate to Peter Parker, who despite being able to climb walls and throw cobwebs has problems as human as those of any of us. In this movie, we get to see Stan's iconic cameo saving a girl from the rubble. The movie was an even bigger hit and the company didn't stop anymore. They continued with Daredevil, Hawk, Spider-Man 2, The Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Thor, Avengers, Captain America, The Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, Black Panther, Ant-Man, and even Venom, to name just a few. However, this work of making cameos implies a physical effort that, due to Stan's advanced age, was increasingly difficult for him to perform. He was an older man now, and the fans were aware of it. Still, Stan continues to leverage his image and voice to convey positive messages to the world and youth. However, on November 12, 2018, the creator of an entire fantastic universe lost his life. Stan Lee passed away at the age of 95. One of his last lectures before his death took place at the University of Los Angeles, where he told a brief anecdote about how he created Spider-Man. This simple story, in my opinion, left us two of the most important teachings of his life in this talk, with everything we have already seen. That when he came with his superiors to present the idea of Spider-Man to them, they seemed unity, terrible, and without future. But since Stan had faith in his project, he went ahead and found a way to show the world his new creation, which turned out to be a success. In that sense, the first lesson that leaves us in this conference is, and I quote it, "If you have an idea that you genuinely believe in, pursue it and don't let any fool. Doesn't it convince you otherwise?" And the second lesson he leaves us is through his work, and specifically through the creation of superheroes. Like Spider-Man, it's his vision of superheroes as ordinary people who have been given an extraordinary gift. These were not perfect, unattainable role models, but human beings with virtues and flaws, people who faced everyday problems like the rest of us. This means that we can identify with them, although we may not be able to feel as reflected in a green giant like Hawk, in a god of thunder like Thor, or in a hard creature that can scale walls and throw cobwebs like Spider-Man. Yes, we can do it with someone who falls in love, who faces family problems, or with a young man trying to make his way into adulthood like Peter Parker. Stan Lee understood that superheroes were only a part of his characters, but what really made them special was their humanity, their fears, their doubts, and their emotions. All of us, although we do not possess superpowers, have unique talents, skills, and abilities that, well directed, can make us heroes in our own. For me, Stan's superpower was to create characters and stories that inspired others. Stan Lee's life also teaches us that being a hero is not about what you can do, but what you choose to do with what you have. Just as Stan did by creating characters that inspire others to believe in themselves, we can leverage our own abilities to positively impact the world, help others, be extraordinary at what we do, take care of our family, be good parents, mothers, friends, and be kind. That's our superpower, and like Stan heroes should, we can use it to make this world a better place for you who made it to the end. Thank you very much for watching the full video. I want to thank you also for all your support and remind you that if you have not subscribed to my channel, do so at this moment. The truth is, you would support me a lot, and that way you also make sure you don't miss any of my videos. No more. You and I will see you in the next video.